Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next session, which is called Narratives of Equiano's Africa. We have three wonderful speakers here today. Jordan Taliha McDonald is a PhD candidate in English at Harvard University, but she's also a public writer, essayist, critic, editor, and cultural worker, sometimes poet. She studies Black diasporic literatures, rhetoric, critical theory, and visual culture, and her academic work is particularly interested in how anti-Blackness informs and exceeds philosophical, psychoanalytic, political, and literary discourses, especially on betrayal. She's also the co-host of Lose Your Sister, the podcast, and her peer-reviewed article, Catching Strays on Pet Negroes, the Black Domestic and the Politics of Comfort, was published recently in the Moral Economies issue of Southern Cultures. So we're very glad to have Jordan with us today. Professor Jude Okpala is at the University of Texas in San Antonio, where I used to teach too, and we're former colleagues. He is a professor of philosophy and classics, and he also teaches in literature and film. His short stories, criticisms, and poems are to be found in collections like Ethelbert Miller's Beyond the Frontier and the Sonia Sanchez Literary Review, Black British Writing and Black British Aesthetics Today. His previous works include The Visible Man and The Uncircumcised. His most recent book is a wonderful collection of short stories called Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of Lower Niger, a collection that tells the stories of African womanhood and what it is imagined to be. And we also have with us today Professor Chigbo Arthur Anyaduba from the University of Winnipeg. His teaching and research interests focus broadly on African and African Black diaspora literatures, as well as on literatures of genocide and mass atrocities. In his scholarship, he explores the cultural representations of genocide and mass atrocities in Africa, and is currently focusing on the representations of mass starvation of Igbo populations and mass starvation as a tool of colonial control during the Biafra Nigeria War, 1967 to 1970. Chigbo was also the author of a book, the post-colonial African genocide novel, Quests for Meaningfulness, from 2021. Thank you all so much, and I very much look forward to your conversation. I think Jordan's going to start us off.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in to our panel today. My reflection begins at the point I imagine that all of us kind of enter, which is with Equiano's narrative itself. The 1789 slave narrative and autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of Oluda Equiano. In the 235 years since its publication, The Interesting Narrative has established Equiano as a global icon of the transatlantic slave trade and a writer whose testimony of a single life spanning over 3 continents has served as a prism through which a reflected glimpse of racial slavery's brutality and abolition's capacity can be seen. It's only fitting then that as time passes, the narrative has only grown more interesting as it draws us to the refractions of freedom and slavery in Equiano's own life, while also training our attention to the forces which enable the redirection of power and relation. As a scholar of discourses of betrayal and complicity in the literature and political rhetoric of and concerning the African diaspora, I come to Equiano's narrative with a particular interest in the ways that these themes and discourses appear not only in his narrative of slavery, but also in the ways that his autoethnographic depiction of his African homeland prior to his enslavement and his post-emancipation participation in slave economies have been figured in scholarly debates as evidence of narrative impurity or political inconsistency. In her essay on Equiano entitled The Spirit of Trade, Oluda Equiano's Conversion, Legalism, and the Merchant's Life, Elizabeth Jane Wall Hines considers what it means that Equiano, quote, appears complicit with the systematic enslavement of Africans by virtue of his trading from merchant vessels that also carry slaves, a fact which, as Hines points out, has led some to, quote, distrust his abolitionist arguments in the life. Noting how the seeming complicity implied by Equiano's adherence to Western culture, capital accumulation, and religious conversion have been taken up by other scholars, Hines offers both Chinsole's 1982 thesis of assimilation as abolitionist strategy and Catalin Orban's 1993 proposal that we read Equiano's acculturation as neither ironic nor strategic, but rather as a genuine display of his, quote, conflation of Europe with Africa. Hines, on the other hand, makes irony central to her reading of Equiano, who, as she notes in his role as a, quote, traitor and slave at once, effectively performs an equivalence between Africa and Africa's slave owners. The particularities of these debates aside, what binds Hines, Chinsole, and Orban's divergent interpretations of Equiano's complicity is the shared sense that it must be attended to in ways which aim to determine the nature of Equiano's status as a potential accomplice, largely based on matters of authentic belief, agency, and analytical accuracy. In this discursive hurry to convict, contextualize, or rescue/reframe Equiano's so-named complicity, I'm struck by the limited attention paid to the ways in which complicity itself is conceptually bound up and remade by the social, political, and philosophical landscape of racial slavery. For the remainder of this reflection, I'd like to zero in on the language and concept of adultery as it circulates in the legal and rhetorical world of slavery and abolition, between which Equiano's own narrative is lodged, and as it proves emblematic of the centrality of complicity to the logics of racial slavery. So turning back to Equiano's narrative for a moment, we can recall that when Equiano speaks of his native land, Asaka, now southeastern Nigeria, and the customs of his people, he draws particular attention to the cultural policies concerning marital infidelity. He writes, quote, "Adultery, however, was sometimes punished with slavery or death, a punishment which I believe is inflicted on it throughout most of the nations of Africa. So sacred among them is the honor of the marriage bed, and so jealous are they of the fidelity of their wives. The men, however, do not preserve the same constancy to their wives, which they expect from them, for they indulge in a plurality, though seldom in more than two." End quote. Equiano goes on to provide an account of a time when he witnessed the socio-legal proceedings that followed an adultery conviction in Asaka. Quote, "Of this I recollect an instance. A woman was convinced before the judges of adultery and delivered over, as the custom was to her husband to be punished. Accordingly, he determined to put her to death. But it being found just before her execution that she had an infant at her breast and no woman being prevailed on to perform the part of a nurse, she was spared on account of the child." Now, this section of the autobiography has received a great deal of attention and scrutiny from those concerned with proving or disproving the validity of Equiano's birth on the African continent, as well as those who find Equiano's account of Asaka to be too reminiscent of European ethnographic writings. With this highly contested and complex section in mind, I'd like to reflect upon the significance of adultery as an idea and event in 18th and 19th century accounts of the enslavement of African-descended peoples, so as to better situate Equiano's incorporation of these details in his narrative and to kind of walk out my suspicion that complicity is not a discrete unit in the history of racial slavery. So far, my research into the circulation of adultery in this discourse has fit into three main categories. The first concerns the meaning of adultery for the European. As literary scholar Tony Tanner asserts in Adultery in the Novel, Contract and Transgression, Western conceptions of adultery by the 18th and 19th century can be best understood through the concept of a, quote, extra-contractual contract, or indeed an anti-contract. Thus, we ought to think more about what it means that Equiano's incorporation of adultery in his narrative would have been met by a British readership whose literary consumption of material concerning adultery primarily consisted of, quote, bourgeois novels. In this context, the depiction of adultery in Equiano's narrative of Asaka not only conjured the cultural understanding of adultery as the anti-contract for this audience, but also by virtue of his racial and geographic difference from his readership, arguably offered a subtly illicit exposure of the relational, and by relational I mean affective, sexual, possessive, and legal structure of a society that was blackened in the view of the narrative's primary consumers. And so here I'm really interested in thinking about what this kind of illicit potential of the content might have meant for those who were consuming Equiano's narrative at that time, many of which would have been white British women in the kind of abolitionist movement. And then second, I'm interested in thinking more about the ways in which adultery on the African continent was being interpreted at this time, particularly in that ethnographic record that is frequently used to kind of question Equiano. And so slavery scholar Jetta Wimler's essay, Witchcraft, Murder, and Adultery, Slavery as Punishment in European Writings about Atlantic Africa around 1800, looks at 18th and 19th century European colonial fixations with African social policies, such as those which regarded adultery as punishable by enslavement. In this article, Wimler argues that European interpretations of African legal strictness or leniency were used to buttress arguments for racial slavery as a civilizing and culturally familiar practice for Black Africans, while also proving instrumental in efforts to promote the maintenance of European political orders threatened by revolt or reform. And so they would kind of use what they perceived as the harshness of African social policies to say that we need to maintain the European political order as it is to discourage European revolt. And Wimler also looks at the work of Levon Bonaventure Proyart, a member of the Catholic clergy who authored a book in 1776 on the history of Luango, Kakongo, and other kingdoms of Africa, which he compiled from a number of missionary writings, having never been to the African continent himself. And Wimler notes that in her research that Proyart emphasizes that, quote, the societies under investigation consider adultery the greatest crime, as they believe marriage to be indissoluble. In her words, quote, these deliberations about the crime of adultery appear in a passage that seeks to prove that the people Proyart describes are not morally debased, as previous authors suggest. Marital laws, the separation of the genders, and the punishment inflicted on adulterers are taken as proof of high morality, and thus the ease with which they could be converted. And so we see here that there's this interesting way in which the leniency in cases in which African communities or kingdoms were regarded as having lenient views on adultery, then that was considered a basis for their need for civilizing. But if they had harsh policies or strict policies regarding adultery, this was then regarded as a kind of easy entry point for the imposition of conversion. And some kind of side questions we might consider. We might also think about Natasha Lightfoot's work in Troubling Freedom on the Moravian Church's disciplinary records post-emancipation concerning the adulterous relations of Black Antiguans, and the Freedmen's Bureau in the United States, which develops post-emancipation, also includes records reporting infidelity and marital disputes amongst the formerly enslaved. And so there is this very complex history in which adultery is being monitored and assessed in African descended populations. And then on the flip side, we might also think about how the history of anti-polygamy in the West is heavily racialized. The second category, or the third category of research that I'm looking into, concerns the rhetorical life of adultery in abolitionist letters. And this really looks like the ways in which adultery is used as rhetorical grounds for abolition. And so this normally entails arguments in which the sanctity of marriage is said to prevail over slavery's theft of Christian marital value and virtue. And we see this in the work of abolitionist and Minister Pillsbury Parker's early anti-slavery work, The Church as It Is, or The Forlorn Hope of Slavery, in which he poses the corollary, slavery is adultery, in order to justify abolition. But then we also see this in a similar vein to Equiano in Frederick Douglass's articulation in his 1845 narrative that the slave driver on his former plantation, quote, may be said to have been guilty of compelling his women slaves to commit the sin of adultery. And so there are these ways in which the language of adultery circulates in abolitionist letters in this way that attempts to kind of use the sanctity of marriage of monogamous marriage in particular as a kind of foundation for rhetorical claims about abolition. And so what I have accumulated here in this reflection so far are just a few of the historical objects and ideas that continue to raise larger questions for me about the conceptual significance of adultery in the rhetorical, literary, and historical discourse on racial slavery and racial Blackness. Equiano's own invocation of adultery in his homeland fits within this tapestry of texts as an example of the ways that existing social contracts, such as marriage, were implicated and remade by the development of racial slavery. Placing adultery under the larger umbrella of terms which mark the racialization of complicity, terms like criminal, for example, we might think of as belonging in this kind of family of terms, we can open up new possibilities for thought. Some of the questions I'm asking myself are, what if complicity were not an incidental consideration in our work on slavery and its afterlife? What if we did not limit the scope of our considerations to exceptional individuals and or singular complicit acts, but rather wrestled more dexterously with the ways that racial slavery not only reduces complicity to redundancy, but also the ways that Blackness as a technology of naming effectively disorients a lot of the ethical grammar of relations that gives complicity its coherence. And that's kind of where I'm sitting and what I'm kind of working through, and Equiano has been a kind of entry point for that. Yes, and so I'll stop there.
That's pretty good, Jordan. Okay. Yes, you actually talked about quite a lot about what I have in mind, and there are some concepts you threw out that I will want to revisit maybe after Chigbo has already presented his own reflection. But overall, I would say that your reflection, of course, is doing what it's supposed to do, looking at seemingly Equiano's narrative as a slave narrative, what my professor used to call emancipatory narrative. And what I see as your position, that reflection, is really looking at the inhibition of emancipation or racial emancipation, as the case may be. But I want to locate my own reflection in the context of the spirit of Olufemi Taiwo's book, Against Decolonization. And I'm doing that as a way of trying to flip, as the case may be, the narrative of looking at 18th century African texts or texts written by Africans talking about slavery and emancipation. So I will position myself as a diasporan African thinker and focus more so on the narrative of atrocities in Africa itself, atrocities engendered by Africans. Because when we look at these 18th century texts or 18th century slave narratives, we oftentimes distance ourselves from the continent and not looking at forms of atrocities in the continent that is quite representative of the atrocities of slavery. So these atrocities for me do not occur only through killings of people or through massacres, but mainly when we Africans do not exercise our right to responsibility, a right we have forgotten as we clamor for the other forms of rights, racial liberation, and so forth and so on. So we don't really look back on ourselves to see whether what we are doing ourselves really needs to be changed or talked about. So speaking of global Equiano, one would immediately think of all the vagaries of slavery and transatlantic brutality, which Jordan quite well articulated. But one would also think of colonial discourse and also of emancipatory narrative, which Equiano's narrative is just that. And then cherish all the forms of aesthetics Equiano himself made possible, while talking about different traditions, because we can read him as African, we can read him as British, we can also read him as American, and read him as African American. So that the complexity of his work is really what leads me to reflect the way I'm doing. But I want to, of course, align the politics of decolonialism and anti-racism, that is, the aesthetics of the empire rise back, with forgetful memories that have become the black beast of African consciousness, that is killing of Africans by Africans and enslaving of Africans by Africans, and of course, the one-term ill treatment of Africans by Africans. So this sort of atrocities, for me, strategically undermines the historic impact of Equiano, including his struggles for freedom and equality, his establishment of his personhood. So without our craze for decolonialism or decolonization and post-colonial and anti-racist engagement, we have become quite forgetful of self-reflection. And when I say we, I'm referring to Africans and Blacks in diaspora as well, and all forms of Blackness across the continent. We have become quite forgetful of self-reflection and critical questions about our selfhood. What is Africa today? How would Equiano think about Africa today? How have we pivoted from our understanding of colonial discourse, what we always challenge? Are our relationship with ourselves not reenactment of transatlantic slave trade? My country, Nigeria, for example, is a brazier of visibility of the metaphor of slave tradition, ranging from absence of freedom to organized cruelty and systemic disenfranchisement. The youth in Nigeria are hopeless because of the bleakness of their future. Yes, the bleakness is traceable to perfunctory leadership and conscientious act of license. No, not freedom, because freedom goes with the right to responsibility. Now, there's a concept, it is also a language in my country, which is called Japa. I'm sure Chigbo understands that very well, but I will explain it. Japa is nothing but a mode of existence. It is a Yoruba term that signals exodus, leaving a place in haste because it is not conducive to existence. Nigerians now are now suffering from what I call Japa syndrome. And I'm sure Chigbo's conference is going to really talk about that. Japa underscores voluntary migration and entrance in some situations into bondage, not travel and self-discovery in Europe, America, Asia, Canada, Oceania, etc. We are migrating from ourselves, and we still talk about anti-racist discourse and slavery. I'm not saying we should abandon anti-racist discourse or stop calling out hegemonies of power or stop rereading Equiano to see the intricacies and complexities of racial slavery. Our critique should be tinged with self-reflection. There are proverbs in my language which I would like to render in translation, and one of them says, One should be beautiful at home before being beautiful outside. The second one says, a person whose house is on fire does not pursue rats. Now, this proverb signifies on securing the home as an enabling space and foundation for any other forms of engagement. Our encounter with the West and challenge of its forms of truth must be founded on our encounter with the African selves, who must exercise their right to responsibility. If not, engagement with Equiano and exploration of his legacies will only be good for academic discourse. We will just organize a conference and talk about Equiano, and then everybody goes home. Now, I remember a point I shared with a colleague recently at Dickens Society's conference in Birmingham, United Kingdom, how Dickens ripped pages of Frederick Douglass's narrative, the Dublin edition, where Douglas talks about the atrocities of slavery with panoramic vision, before giving the book to his friend, William Charles Macready. Dickens' reason for doing that, he wanted to save his friend from experiencing that atrocity and invariably saving his friend from paroxysms of emotion from reading, quote, this is Douglas's word, hideous and abominable portrait by Douglas about slavery. Now, I share that point to suggest Charles Dickens' technique of secrecy, yet I wonder about the benefit of that critical exposition at that conference to Africa, to the suffering people of Africa whose suffering are well wrought by their fellow Africans. What happens is not too far away from what Equiano describes in his narrative, the terror, the depression, quote, his horror and anguish, and his awareness of his moribundity are indicative of Nigerians' experiences today. So my reflection might not essentially focus on the content of the narrative, but I'm looking at the spirit of the narrative and then looking back at Africa to see how Africa is really continuing the spirit of the text of Equiano's narrative, or if we are actually replicating what Equiano himself was critiquing and writing about and was also fighting about with the text and with all his movements in England and across England. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I would like to share my screen. Before I start, thanks a lot to Kerry and the organizers of this symposium for having me, and it's been exciting listening to Jordan and Jude. I think I resonated much more with Jordan's critique of the narrative of complicity than Jude's charge for African responsibility in that sense, because and upfront, I don't like Olufemi Taiwo's against the conversation for so many reasons that I won't get into in the context of our conversation today, but because I think it does all the textbook kind of stuff that white supremacist discourse expects, especially asking us to take responsibility for our own violation and the injustices that continue to define and shape reality for many Africans. So yeah, I just feel there's that idea of responsibility is so charged and loaded that I usually cringe when Africans are asked to take some kinds of responsibilities for what going on the continent, or for Nigerian youths to be responsible for desiring something better and then running out of the country as a response to ongoing forms of enslavement and colonial violence. But my presentation today is not as organized as the one both of you have given. It's more of offering some general reflections on Equiano's interesting narrative based on various, although related impressionistic ideas that held my attention in some parts of the book, focusing on Equiano's Africa. And I specifically will be looking at Equiano's portrayal of his African homeland, as well as the significance of Equiano's work on African writing in the 20th century onward. And while I won't go deeply into the book in my reflection, I think my broader goal is to recover and recenter Africa in Equiano studies and the broader Black Atlantic discourse that often tend to sideline Africa or invoke it marginally as the beginning point of enslavement, but not usually as the destination and site of slavery itself. And although unnecessary, I want to say briefly only because of my interest in centering the Africa portrayed in Equiano's work, that the claims made by historians like Vincent Carretta, and I know Jordan talked about this briefly, historians who suggest that Equiano was not born in Africa and that he fabricated his African birth, I don't give serious weight to that claim. I consider that to be fictitious and malicious at best, in fact, racist, and that began even at the time of Equiano's publication of the book. And as some other historians have, I think, convincingly shown, evidence from Equiano's book contradicts the notion that he wasn't born in Africa. And one such example is Equiano's description of his people's practice of circumcision, which was not widely practiced in North America at the time, if at all. But beyond these points, in my opinion, the accounts of his homeland and childhood experiences in the interesting narrative are genuine and could not have been fabricated. The way he describes his homeland, including the landscape, could only have come from someone who knew and experienced the place relatively well. My point is that I approach his work with this perspective, not with the skepticism of whether he was born in Africa or not. So on naming, in the opening chapter of the interesting narrative, Equiano provides an account of his people's cultural practices regarding marking time, age, seasons, and transitions. And in the context of this description of cultural practice, he also describes the meaning behind his own name, Olaudah, stating that it signifies vicissitude or fortunate, as well as being one favored and having a loud voice and well-spoken. The passage raises for me questions about why Equiano introduces his name in this context by interrupting the flow of the description on general cultural practices. And it seems he may be aiming to insert his individuality into the collective, which some critics have pointed out, or perhaps emphasizing the importance of his name within his culture. But what particularly captivated me in this passage were the meanings behind Equiano's name. It is commonly understood that Igbo names often function as prophecies. And in Equiano's case, it seems to truly embody the meaning of, or that he embodied the meaning of his name by using his prominently loud voice to speak out against slavery. And in present-day Igbo region, where Equiano is believed to come from, his name would be rendered as Olaudah, which translates again to loud voice. What intrigued me even more was the potential significance of paying attention to the importance of name as prophecy throughout the interesting narrative. that Equiano listed meanings associated with his name suggests not only his investment in the significance of naming, considering again his adoption of Gustavus Vasa, the name of a Swedish revolutionary leader, but even more so, his apparent belief that name is destiny, or that one's name can shape one's destiny. So if we approach the interesting narrative, and this is a question I'm asking myself, if we approach the interesting narrative with this understanding that Equiano sought to connect the vagaries of his experiences to the fortunes of his name, what changes in our understanding of the book? Equiano's Africa is a place and time of rampant enslavement. Although unlike the colonial image that has now come to characterize Africa as a place of lack, a place of starvation, indescribable poverty, and death, Equiano recalls his African homeland fondly as a place of plentiful, of nourishment, and vibrant cultural life. But it's also threatened by slavery. And Equiano's childhood is lived in constant fear of slavery, and one can only imagine what manner of living that was. His homeland and surrounding regions of what European enslavers called the slave coast were reduced to slave societies. In other words, nations were reduced to slave farms for European imperial capture and transportation across Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And the point here for me is that even before he knew and experienced slavery, Equiano was already a subject of enslavement. So to be born in a world condemned to slavery is to be predetermined in advance as a slave. So his enslavement, therefore, did not begin when he and his sister are kidnapped and sold into slavery. His enslavement is already a priori and a destiny to be lived. So in such a world where slavery is lived prior to and post-experience, where slavery is destiny and order, what does freedom mean? And how is freedom conceived, and how can it be deliberated or imagined? In the context of Jude's presentation, I think I'll frame it as, how can someone be responsible in that world? So what I find curious, though, is that Equiano's interesting narrative offers a glimpse into an African world that has continued to function both as nightmare and nostalgia for Africans like Jude and I, who are not on the continent, but somehow recall nostalgically the fond memories as well as the nightmarish experiences of being on the continent. Yet the past that some canonized Nigerian and also other African writers of the mid-20th century returned to repeatedly in their works to interpret the colonial experience was not, so to speak, the pre-colonial past that critics often claim. Instead, it was Equiano's time and the era of slavery. And if you consider, for example, Chinua Achebe's famous novels, Things Fall Apart and Arrow of God, which are widely known for exploring the so-called collapse of a pre-colonial indigenous world when confronted with European colonial forces in the late 19th or early 20th century. But I think that labeling the temporal and historical settings of these novels as pre-colonial is inaccurate for understanding the historical and cultural backgrounds depicted in these stories. For example, in Arrow of God, we learn that Olu, the founding deity of the United Nations of Omuaro, came into existence in response to the patterns of slave raiding described by Equiano in the interesting narrative. And as described in Equiano's book, European enslavers and their agents targeted vulnerable nations and enslaved their young people, often children like Equiano and the sister. So to protect themselves from these existential threats and resist European imperial destiny of enslavement, the 7 nations of Omuaro united to form a stronger nation with greater resources to defend against slavery. The constitution that binds these nations together is symbolized by Olu, a god of liberation. So therefore, categorizing Olo, which is a symbol of this constitutional and liberationist response to the violence of slavery, as pre-colonial is inadequate. Understanding for me the tragedy of Arrow of God, as I see it, involves contextualizing the historical origins of Olo in slavery, not in pre-colonial discourse, and appreciating the relative successes and failures of the Olo resistance, both in terms of its historical and cultural implications. There is this popular charge against African writers, championed by notable African writers themselves, such as the Ghanaian writer Equiano. And this charge suggests that African writers, particularly the anti-colonial writers of the 20th century, have been reluctant to address slavery in their works, and as a result, failed to grasp the usable memory of slavery in the decolonization struggle by usually focusing on the period of European colonization in the late 19th century as the pivotal historical crisis. But this claim is not entirely accurate, as the example of Achebe's Arrow of God shows. If anything, the ghosts of slavery from Equiano's time walk all over African writings, past and present. And speaking of ghosts, let's consider this image of European enslavers as bad spirits in the interesting narrative. There's a part of the narrative where Equiano describes, the part where he gets on the slave ship. He says, I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was not persuaded that I had not gotten into a world of bad spirits, and so on. So in Equiano's Africa, enslaved people encounter European enslavers as cannibalistic bad spirits out to eat or devour them. Now there's some literal and metaphorical truths to this sense of slavery as Europe's cannibalism of Africa, not least the literal practice of enslaving African bodies and nations and feeding them to the colonial plantation and industry, but also the terror that is slavery. And this terror, which Equiano describes as both an astonishment and a horror, produced a cultural trope that continues to articulate, I think, the African condition of imperial enslavement. And there's a popular folk tale that circulated interestingly across several West African nations, and particularly in the so-called slave coast regions. There are several versions of the story, although similar in some respects for most of them that I have heard. The version I heard several times as a child tells about a princess who discovered through a mirror gifted to her father by a stranger that she's exceptionally beautiful. And with this discovery came a new awareness and desire, so that the princess refuses to marry any of the eligible men in her nation and the surrounding nations. And her desire is to marry a man as beautiful as herself. Her reputation for refusing viable suitors grows and spreads to the world again of bad spirits and monsters, if you like. And one spirit in particular, the ugliest one in this monstrous world, decides to capture the princess. And to accomplish his mission, he travels to different parts of the world, borrowing the best body parts, so that by the time he arrives in the homeland of our African princess, he has become transformed into a most beautiful man. And nothing would shake the princess's resolve that this beautiful man is unsuitable for her. And so they marry. And the couple begin their journey back to the man's home. And as they go back, the spirit begins to return the body parts that he has borrowed, until on reaching his home, he has become fully transformed into the ugly monstrosity that he is. And as expected, subsequently enslaves the princess. Now, there are several ways to interpret this story, including a modest interpretation of it as a cautionary tale based on the aphorism that all that glitters is not gold, or a tale about how men disguise their monstrosity when in search of a wife, but transforms into what they truly are in marriage. and so on. And one can also understand the story as a ploy of a patriarchal society to manage the ambitions and desires of its young women by sowing a kind of nationalistic creed that what is in the community is better and safer than what is outside, and so on. And the known is better than the unknown and the uncertain in that sense. Yet there's also the clear indication that the story can be understood as an allegory of African enslavement. For one, the presence of mirror, an artifact of slavery, as a corrupting force of feminine self-perception is not to be taken lightly in the story. In some other accounts of the story, there are no mirrors, but a magician or some figure of artifice. Then there's the bad spirit in the story, which apparently is the figure of a white man known in several African folk tales for his ability to borrow, wear, and discard human body parts at will. The cruelty and inhumanity of Europeans must have been the basis for such an imagination of Europeans as bad cannibalistic spirits and monstrosities associated with the ability to borrow body parts to disguise and to enslave. But there's an extended version of the tale that I just recounted, found in Amos Tutuola's famous novella, The Palm Wine Drinkard, in which a hero embarks on an adventure to successfully rescue our princess from the monster. And I suspect that several African writing and other cultural expressions since the dawn of Atlantic slavery have been grappling with this bad spirit. In Tutuola's fantasy, the enslaved African subject must be courageously and heroically rescued from the monster's prison as the beginning of liberationist struggle. And one finds a different version of this tale in Usman Semben's famous feature film, La Noado, or Black Girl, as more popularly known in its English translated edition. The film, or the short story it was adapted from, recounts a slightly similar story of an African woman's desire for freedom that ends up in her enslavement in France. Unlike Tutuola's novella, liberation in Semben's Black Girl is expressed through suicide, which is both an act of resistance and freedom in the work. Equiano's response, on the other hand, is neither rescue nor suicide. Instead, he offers the gift again of his loud voice, like the Igbo Ekwe music, if I invoke his last name, that can resound across place and time. And this gift serves as a legacy for the kinds of struggle that I think was not available to him in his time. Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. That's very nice, Chigbo. Very
Yes.
nice. Yeah, I think I will need some clarifications of concepts. I'm sure I'm dislocating them now from context because I heard them when you were talking about them, but I will throw them out and then give you opportunity to explain further. So since Chigbo, since you just spoke, so I'm going to start with you and then I'll go back to Jordan and then I'll leave you there. Yeah, you said something quite interesting to me when you were talking about slavery in general, and you say that slavery was a priori in the African setting. In other words, it's a determined reality for the Africans because there's a condition that made it possible. So the phrase you use, which I wrote down, is that slavery is a destiny. So I didn't quite grapple that very well. How is slavery destiny within the context of your reflection?
Well, yeah, so what I meant in the context of Equiano's world and experience is simply that to live in that world, a world that was already shadowed by slavery as a child, you probably are not aware of this horrible thing hovering above you, right? So he became more or less aware of this monstrosity by the time he was enslaved, and then he lives through that. And that informs, of course, part of what he writes or recollects about that experience. But I'm saying that that society itself, to live within that moment, even without being aware or conscious of slavery, because you haven't experienced it or because it's distant, didn't mean you weren't already an enslaved person, right? So to be enslaved was prior to the experience for an individual like Equiano, right? And it's the same for many of us today who think we are no longer living slavery because we've not experienced certain forms of slavery or that colonization is over. My contention is, in fact, again, coming from the context of Equiano's work, that the experience of these kinds of horrifying, traumatic presents and histories and so on, prior to experience, they already inform who you are. That's how your subjectivity is in fact produced, so that it's shaped as a destiny that you then strive to escape or live against or grapple with in different ways in which that system and that monstrosity figures. So that in Equiano's world, slavery is both destiny and sort of, yeah, that's the point.
Yeah, I understand that now, but seeing slavery as a condition, seeing slavery as a reality produced by another, and then looking at destiny as something that is antithetical to freedom, I'm finding it very hard to understand who made that condition possible for there to be slavery as destiny. In other words, is it ontological? Was it pre-existing before the Africans came there, or is it coterminous with African reality before the actual slavery? So how did it come? How did that condition come about for it to inform the African destiny?
I'm not saying it informs the African destiny. I'm saying it shapes what destiny becomes. So if, for example, you are born into a world and you desire as destiny to be free, that freedom is not neutral from the very condition of your enslavement, right? So the very conditioning of what becomes destiny is already manufactured by a system that you are grappling with. In the African context that Equiano is born into, that destiny is to be free from slavery, right? But that slavery also shapes what destiny becomes, right? So that world is not free from how you make sense of what, including what we are grappling with presently, to identities. What does it mean to live in our world? What does freedom mean? They are already shaped by the very structures and systems of violence that we are trying to think through.
Okay, thank you. And this actually connects to me, really, and that's why I'm seeking this clarification to Jordan's concept of narrative impurity. Once I heard that, I had to write it down, because it's not only that it's an elegant phrase, but it informs, for me, all these kinds of narrative I read in African literature or African American literature. So could you talk a little more about what you mean by narrative impurity in the context of Equiano's interest in narrative?
Yes, thank you for the question. I guess for me, I think in some ways my phrasing of narrative impurity, I think, has a lot to do with what I would say is kind of generally what we might think of as what the slave narrative is up against, right, as a genre, right, that there are particular kinds of scrutiny and attention that are paid to the slave narrative. And I think to connect back to also what Chigbo was saying about the kind of questioning of the authenticity of his birth, right, I think that these are dynamics that are not simply about Equiano, right? Like these are dynamics that I think have a particular connection to the failure of the slave narrative to produce a pure testimony, right? That it is a heavily mediated genre of writing, that it is struggling to meet some of the genre expectations and also exceeding those genre expectations in many ways. but also that I believe it's Avery Gordon who talks about this, but he says that essentially like one of the main kinds of questions that is being kind of put up against the slave narrative in these early kinds of publications, right, in the West is this kind of a question of like, well, how can known liars be truthful, right? That no one actually believes the slave when one gets the opportunity to speak on slavery, like who is the authority on whether or not this is accurate, who is the authority on whether or not this testimony is pure. And then of course you have the actual formal problem of like white editors mediating all of these texts. And then of course, like majority European white American readerships. So, I mean, these texts are being heavily mediated on all sides. And I think in some ways it is a test that he is bound to fail in particular way. And so I think that that's what I'm also kind of interested in, and how that desire for purity, I think, is perhaps also connected to the kind of racial problem of complicity, I think. And perhaps I think that maybe is also connected to the tension you all were bringing up around the language of responsibility, which I think is maybe at the core of these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I recall my professors talking about the question of authenticity when it comes to slave narrative. Even one of my professors refused to call it slave narrative and change the name to what she calls emancipatory narrative, because said that slave narrative conditions it and makes us to keep bringing up this question of authenticity. Is it true or is it not true? But if you read it as emancipatory narrative, you will see that the voice, of course, is telling the story of freedom. So it is more so better to look at it from that angle than looking at the history of slavery that lists the whole structure of the narrative. So that's good for me. So that's the two questions that I really wanted to ask in order to understand better these two concepts I dislocated from your presentations. Thank you. And Chigbo, I cherish your, I don't want to call it refusal, but a response to to Taiwo's spirit. I call it spirit because I don't agree with the content of the argument, but the spirit, which is pushing the colonized, quote unquote, the colonized, or pushing Africans to begin to think about agency. I think it's important because we can do both. We can do what you're saying, Chigbo, and also think about agency. How do we really play in this situation in order to recover, let me put it that way, in order to recover from the angst of colonialism or the angst of slavery. So I'm gonna stop there and see if Kerry has any.
Or maybe before you stop, I think maybe you can elaborate a little bit, because the my problem with that is to assume, for example, that the colonized as a category has some kind of agency that stands outside of the very condition of coloniality that allows these subjects to make decisions or take responsibility in different ways. So think of Nigeria, for example, since we are very familiar with Nigeria. Nigeria cannot be, in any stretch of the imagination, be seen as a place that isn't still colonial. The very constitution of the place, Nigeria itself, was a product of colonization. There was no point from when Nigeria was not colonized in recent histories to the present time. Forget the official thing in the 60s that happened. We know that's a joke. Nigerians do not produce their leaders. The very structures of governance and justice and different kinds of things, even economics, they are not in the hands of Nigerians as free agents, delivering or deliberating on the affairs of their lives and so on. They are all determined outside. They are shaped by the very same structures of slavery and colonization. The very imperial corporations are still in charge, producing violence in different ways to govern and manage. How then can we task Nigerians who don't have any say in any significant way with the kinds of responsibility you are suggesting to recover something and be free and so on. Wouldn't that be an unfair ask?
I appreciate your historical references there, but it is, of course, you know, it is not the whole truth. It's the historical foundation of Nigeria. In the concrete reality of Nigeria, Nigerians do have the responsibility to do what they want to do, but there is, as you very well, there is an elite culture in Nigeria, which has nothing to do with England. It has nothing to do with international politics. It just has everything to do with the structure of Nigeria. And this elite have purchased Nigeria and turned Nigeria into a private property. So that is actually where I'm coming from, because I use a particular phrase. I say that we have what is really called debauchery in Nigeria. And when you take away any dependence in analyzing Nigerian problem on England, on colonialism, you will see that there is a backer in Nigeria that owns Nigeria. And those groups are not international. They're not white people.
But how can we say they are not international when in fact they are? Because again, the very structure that you are describing was also the structure available during slavery, where Europeans weren't simply coming in. They needed agents, right? Who they connived with to perpetrate the kinds of horrors that we are dealing with. The same kind of thing, you know, how would you consider the Nigerian elite that is responsible for the kinds of horror and violence that you're talking about not to be international, not to have connections with the international system of colonial system, but an independent, you know, I just find it difficult to understand.
There's a collusion. I mean, I see the point you're making. There's a collusion. What I'm trying to say in essence is that Nigeria as an entity is not or cannot be removed from the problem that is in Nigeria. Of course, there is, to a degree, the influence that you're talking about, but there is a collusion, and this collusion is championed by this elite that I'm talking about, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, the elite that I'm talking about. Without that system of elitism in Nigerian leadership and politics, then you can talk about something else. But that is really what I'm focusing on. For Nigerians and Africans, it's not just particular to Nigerians. Most African leadership is also structured that way. And you can trace it back to colonialism and to slavery. But there is, therefore, that individual who is perpetrating that violence and atrocity, who's African. So that's what
the
I'm
point,
looking at.
actually. For me, that's actually the very point, in which is why I like the way Jordan unpacked the instrumentality of complicity, because that allows the white supremacist capitalist system to step aside and say, well, we are not responsible, you guys, you know, why are you not looking at your own leaders and so on, as though we are responsible to those leaders. Those leaders are in the employ of that system. They are agents of a powerful capitalist colonial system that unleashes violence on Africans. But I know we can't agree on this today.
Now, I see your point very well, and I respect that.
Because we didn't produce that. It was produced and imposed upon Africans, and Africans try to fight, but then the same system provided the ammunitions to do different. Think of Congo, right? You know, what's going on in Congo. How would you say the Congolese are responsible for their very own violation, and they have to take responsibility for
No,
how
I'm not speaking in the language of Taiwo. I'm not saying that they're responsible for their violation. I'm saying that if you are suffering, let me be a little practical. If you are suffering, you have to understand your suffering, and then you have to do something to ameliorate the condition. That's what I'm talking about. If doing something means fighting whoever you think is the source of your suffering, then you do that. But it's not really saying that I am suffering because you made me to suffer. the
But the
actual
very
concrete
experience of
reality.
suffering can also shape how we think. I'm very
True.
hungry, and the way I'm thinking is how to eat my next meal because of that condition of suffering. And my oppressor presents bread to me. I take the bread and eat to survive. Am I then complicit in my very own violation because I'm not fighting the oppressor handing me bread? I have to be understood as a very subject of that condition of suffering. But when I start judging the kinds of decisions I make based on those, I just feel it becomes unfair not to understand what that subject has become, which is the case for so many Africans. But I don't want us to take all the time, Jordan, because I think Jordan has some really powerful ideas that she explored in her work.
But I agree too, very much so.
You are muted, Kerry.
I mean, I think I want us to say thank you, because I think these are really the very important conversations that have to be had. And clearly more space is needed for these very conversations. And I think this conversation is also a sign of the need for centering Africa, Africans, African diaspora in the conversations about Equiano, because part of why we're doing this whole event is that he has in many ways been captured by Global North academia. He's been disciplined into African American studies or Black British studies. And Jordan, I wonder if you would consider closing us out, because a lot of what this tension is something I feel Equiano absolutely faces head on. This is, and your word complicity is so helpful. He keeps showing himself in these paradoxical positions: enslaved enslaver, ship's captain, ship's cargo, a fighter for the British, a victim of the British. And I feel like this is where the irony plays out all through, that he is caught within this net that Chigbo was describing, but also confronting in the way that perhaps Jude is exhorting us to, that there's no lie there. Or anyway, I wondered if maybe you could close us out with thinking about how complicity is really a tool for us to dig into these.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, I mean, thank you for that invitation to close us out. I mean, I think I'm excited about the way that our conversation kind of turned, because I do think that these are really important questions to be asking. And I think as far as, the particular tension around like, what do we do with the harm that that Black people or Africans in diaspora or on the continent do to one another, right? That this is also, I think a part of what I'm putting on the table, right, with complicity, is that I really think that part of what complicity as a term can do for our thinking around particularly this kind of formation of an idea of racial Blackness and also of racial slavery and colonialism on the continent is also the role of participatory violence in the actual structure as being like foundational. It's actually like really crucial to the way that these things operate, for there to be a kind of blurring of the lines of order, for the triangulation of power to kind of shift its appearance, even if it doesn't shift its structure in particular ways. And I think it's actually really vital, and we see this throughout the slave narratives, Equianos as well, right? That there are these moments where the enslaved are tasked with the violation of other slaves. And I regard that as being as emblematic of slavery as when the master himself facilitates that violence. And so I think for me, that's what I'm trying to work through is if we want to even begin to think about where our accountability or responsibility lies, I think we have to wrestle with that component to get to that place. But I think that these are ultimately questions that we should be asking ourselves and each other. I think increasingly I'm in a place of self-questioning throughout this work.
Well, thank you. And thank you also to the panel for asking the questions, because rather than have the questions imposed from white interlocutors who take ownership of purity or virtue or truth, all of these categories, which again Equiano brings to the table and sort of examines with a microscope. So I want to thank you all so much for these really rich and provocative and important central conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.